employers had actually cooperated with the researchers from further education who had allowed the researchers to go in and ask all these questions. And I was able to use their hospitality to check on the context data. And it was while I was working in Marks and Spencer's warehouse that I began to see richness of the mathematical potential of the working environment of cardboard boxes. In those days, there was no just-in-time delivery. You know, that's the system that ensures that the size you want is just gone.
Yes.
But maybe Marks and Spencer's shop had a warehouse underneath. There was no shrink wrapping and there was no old packs. But I got interested in a couple of packs of 12 of something to eat. I can't remember whether it was honey, but little pots about that size. And there were 12 of them. And they either came in a 6x2 pack or a 4x3 pack. And the 6x2 pack is long and thin, it could break in the middle while being thrown around a warehouse. And a 4x3 pack could be short and fat, and perhaps stronger while you were throwing it around the warehouse, but a bit too chunky to get your hand down, so you slowed it. It would slow you down. So you started asking again, well, why have they chosen this particular pack of this size, and how did they make them anyway? But then in those days, CAD-CAM was still on the horizon, and there were lots of small packaging companies in London. So I went to some to have a look at genuine design problems in all their embedded criteria, as it were. The basic criterion of the design of a carton was, of course, economy. How to maximise the number of cartons you can cut from a single sheet of cardboard with minimum wastage. And I found a whole wonderful world of totally brilliant geometry, derived from the humble rectangle, which tessellates so economically. And I learned about the dimensions of creases. Creases most definitely have dimension, and the importance of having the corrugations running the right way, so you hold the thing in and help it through. And a whole lot more about ingenuity. And that was the origin of the first pack of teaching materials. And what I did was to take real designs problems, straight from factory floors with no editing. Obviously I had to be a bit selective, but I didn't do any editing at all. They were all genuine. And it was I can't remember how many of these things there were, about 20, something like that. And they were separate, loose leaf, in a plastic folder, so that teachers could photocopy them and do what I knew teachers would do anyway, which was to adapt them. And there were some bits of card I put in the pack with advice on where they could get some more, and there was a suggested skills list, but I knew that teachers would adapt that anyway. And there was a cartoon on the front so that nobody could possibly mistake it for a maths textbook. It was a picture of an idiot trying to wrap up a camel in brown paper. And I called it Wrap It Up. And the teachers, the maths teachers across the area that I was working with, absolutely fell on it and knew and did what I knew they would. There was a lot of emphasis in those days on what they were calling teacher-proof materials, which I thought was a pretty fair insult. These teachers, in my experience, knew what they were doing. Anyway, the pack sold out in a matter of days, and we had a lot of fun with Wrap It Up on various ATM courses. And orders started coming in from all over the place, and people started photocopying them and sending them to their friends all over the place, and I started to get orders from Australia. But at that time, Margaret Thatcher decided that she'd had enough of ILIA and set about destroying it. And the first cut that we actually felt was that every discipline, secondary discipline, had to lose an advisory teacher. And maths only had one, and that was me. So on the one hand, I was trying to respond to the demand for the materials that the project was producing. And on the other hand, I was desperately trying to get funding to keep the project going. So I had to fight some more horrendous battles. But I did eventually get some funding from the Department of Education and Science. In fact, it was the last grant before the national curriculum came in. And with that, I had a very warm welcome from C.E. Hoyles at the Institute of Education. Just about saved my life. And of course, universities love it if you turn up with money, don't they? So, maths in work was re-established, and I began to look for a substance like cardboard that is so ordinary and so ubiquitous that people just take it for granted, so that I could do another Wrap It Up. And to me, cloth was the obvious thing. And I started to take a fresh look at that, and that's where the feminist bit came in. I didn't actually go looking for it. But once you get into cloth, it's there. And cardboard, on the other hand, is generally gender-free. But like most women of my age, I grew up through World War II, and there was rationing, and including cloth and clothes. And by the time my generation was about 12, we knew how to put a frock together and knit a sweater and unpick one jumper and make it into another and all that sort of stuff. The same war had tossed me right round the world by the time I was 10, complete circuit. And that experience had placed me within a large number of different contexts. There's all sorts of different people wearing all sorts of different sort of cloth made in all sorts of different ways. So I thought I was onto something. It's sometimes actually very refreshing to look at something through fresh eyes. It works, the ancient technology. Thank you, John, for keeping this one. This is the design on a plaster ceiling of one of those stately homes that gets used as a conference centre. And Celia and her friends then were working on logo. And they thought, so in the barn evening looking at the ceiling, and thought, we can make that with logo. So you've got a whole lot of ellipses, you've got a whole lot of rectangles, we can do that. And so the next day they went back to the computers and they couldn't. They fiddled around and they fiddled around and they could not get a program to generate this pattern. So they got fed up with that and went to bed or whatever. And the following day somebody looked at the same ceiling, not through the eyes of a mathematician, but through the eyes of an artist. Artists, of course, look at the spaces between shapes. And there is the generator. It doesn't have a mathematical name, so they called it rabbit's ears. But you could be certain that the plasterer who put up that ceiling only needed one form. And that was it. So, adding fresh eyes, as it were, to my existing cardboard box and dome question of how the hell did they make that, I started a pack of learning materials using cloth problems instead of cardboard problems, and I called it Cabbage, to the dismay of many people I met in the clothing industry. If you don't know what cabbage is and would like to, could you kindly leave that to the end as well? And I'll explain. So one of the items from the cabbage pack was this one. Again, it was loose leaf, and you've got two bags you've made out of patchwork, and the problem is you decide they're both too small. Let's see if we can make a bigger one that's still square. And where could you do the minimum amount of unpicking and all that. Anyway, the teachers just went to town on it. I'd forgotten to bring the book. There was a book called Common Threads that I wrote. There are pages in it of what the teachers actually got out of that. And this is another one from Cabbage. And I collected this. There was at the time that I was researching it, there was an exhibition of crafts for Bangladesh. And so I put this one. I got this one. And of course, London being London, it was just so easy to go to the Brick Lane Mosque and say, have you got somebody who can translate this on the right typeface in the back? So that was not a problem at all. And teachers incorporated it into a whole lot of stuff that they were doing or about to do on Islamic art. So altogether it was quite a sort of rich response. And so my office began to fill up with all these bits of cloth from all over the place. And a member of my steering committee, who had been aware of the fact that I'd done exhibitions in special needs, she said, why don't you set up an exhibition? And that is how Common Threads started. And I just want to briefly summarise what work was about at this stage. Even though Common Threads did contain examples designed to entice and entertain people, the Maths in Work project which created it was actually not about mathematicians having fun knitting Mobius hats and flying bottles. Good fun though that is, I'm not knocking it, but that's not what it was about. And it was not about sophisticated technologies of the textiles industry, and it was not about applying maths to cloth, and it was not about doing maths with cloth. It was about trying to reveal mathematical thought and activity without which many domestic textiles simply can't be made, whether or not the maker calls it maths. I just think I'd better put in a bit about the Common Threads overseas tour here, in case so that you can pick up on it later. The Institute of Education allowed me to have their gallery for a week because it was empty just before Christmas. Those of you who know the building is where the bookshop now is. So I had this freebie for a week and I put on this exhibition, and so many people wanted to come, we had to turn schools away for health and safety reasons, that people said could they borrow it. So I went out and bought miles and miles of bubble wrap and put this thing on the road, and it toured England for 2 years before it finally fell to bits. But it was obviously having an effect in the two particular areas that were causing quite a lot of concern then, which was the relative failure of girls in school maths and the relative failure of some ethnic minority groups. And I reported these at an international conference, ICBI in Budapest, 1988. And other countries bobbed up and said, we've got the same problems with girls and ethnic minorities, can we borrow the exhibition? And I said, no, you can't because it's fallen to bits. So I went to see the UNESCO man and he said, nice idea, but I haven't got any money. And I went to the British Council man who said, oh yes, we might even have some money. The problem then was that the British Council has a design department. And they took over Common Threads. And the first thing they said to me is, you can't possibly have all those captions in because nobody will read them. And I said, well, the reason you've been asked to take it over was because they had read them. Oh, no, it's in the literature. We'll cut down on the captions. And then they said the thing which I find personally deeply offensive as a fairly rabid anti-colonialist in my time. They said, anyway, we can't put all those maths in because the natives wouldn't understand it. So when they eventually put this exhibition on tour, they made 2 copies. It toured to 22 countries. I visited 13 of them, which was fascinating, but most of what I was doing was actually trying to put the maths back. And did a lot of work with women's groups, which was fascinating as well. But the remains of those 2 exhibitions are what is archived. And it is very, very, very different from the original one. And it contains a lot less maths. Okay. So now, eventually, I come to the incident that's in the blur.